Okay, so I'm going to start with a bit of context for this project. I have argued previously that truth isn't the right epistemic success condition for scientific explanations. Sometimes this is called non-factivism or rejection of veritism without explanation or understanding. Some people who think that this is wrong want to use a commitment to realism, to scientific realism, to support their point of view. Say, we can't be non-factivists about explanation or understanding. We have to accept veritism or factivism because scientific realism, right? Which seems like this sort of important gut level commitment about science. So this talk is my attempt to work through what scientific realism might look like for a non-factivist about explanation and understanding, and to motivate for you that variety of realism. So I'm not going to convince you to be a scientific realist, and I'm not really going to focus on convincing you that non-factivism about explanation and understanding is the way to go, although I will motivate that a bit in order to sort of motivate the challenge here. The point really is to show you that you can be comfortable with being a non-factivist about explanation and understanding, rejecting veritism, because there's so many good reasons to have that view, even if you want to maintain scientific realism. The paper that's related to this talk is forthcoming in a collection on scientific understanding and representation. My paper is part of an exchange in that collection with Christopher Pincock. And this exchange also includes a paper by Chris criticizing whether a non-factivist like mine can support, a non-factivism like mine can support realism, and then responses by each of us to the other's paper. So if you leave my talk today somehow not convinced that I'm absolutely right about everything, then you can look at Chris Pincock's paper and see a very different perspective on this question. Okay, so scientific realism is a thesis about the success of science. Most traditionally, that science has been so successful at prediction. Oops, this is the thing. I need to remember to advance both things. Sorry. No. Sorry, I was hiding that. I was remembering another pre-test, but the arrows aren't working anymore.
Yeah.
The middle thing? No.
Just put your mouse on the screen. No, on the mouse. Yeah.
Okay, give up on this, or this will work. Okay, I'm sorry, everybody. I'm going to start this series of thoughts over. Scientific realism is a thesis about the success of science. So most traditionally, it's the idea that science has been so successful at prediction and guiding action and all the rest of the things that science is good at because its theories are true, or approximately true, or getting closer to being true, or etc. So here, for example, is Anjan Chakravarty in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, who says, scientific realism is a positive epistemic attitude toward the content of our best theories and models, recommending belief in both observable and unobservable aspects of the world described by the sciences. Most people define scientific realism in terms of the truth or approximate truth of scientific theories or certain aspects of theories. So if science is in the business of doing its best to generate true theories, then we should be able to turn to those true theories, or increasingly true theories, for explanatory knowledge, for predictions, and for guidance of our actions and decisions. So the main upshot of my talk today is going to be to prize apart these two parts of this phrase by Chakravarty, or this passage by Chakravarty. The first part being the idea that scientific realism is a positive epistemic attitude about science, and the latter being cashing that out in terms of truth or approximate truth of scientific theories. This is at the heart of what I want to call into question in this talk. So, again, at first glance, the views that are popular in contemporary philosophy of science create challenges for this traditional form of scientific realism that's couched in terms of truth. So to start, there's the embrace of model-based science, which introduces questions about whether theories are even the main epistemic currency in science. Models aren't definitive the way that theories sometimes seem like they are. It's common to employ a variety of models for the same phenomena, for example. There's also the common occurrence of trade-offs among modeling priorities, which calls into question whether the same vehicles can even deliver explanations, predictions, and policy guidance. So maybe we need to employ a variety of models to accomplish all of our goals. Again, seeming to sort of start to put some pressure on this idea that this traditional form of scientific realism couched in terms of truth is the way to go. And finally, the widespread importance of idealization is taken by some at least, to cast doubt on the idea that the best scientific theories are true, approximately true, or increasing in degree of truth over time. So this is the sort of non-factivist position that, as I said, is taken to put pressure on a commitment to scientific realism. So the most basic formulation of scientific realism, as the claim that science has been and will continue to be epistemically successful, is deeply appealing. So again, I'm not going to convince you of this, but hopefully you feel that tug as well. It sure seems like a bunch of scientists do. In this talk, I'm going to use the challenges of modeling, and especially of widespread idealization, to motivate the view that scientific realism should be fully divorced from the idea that science is in the business of generating true theories. So I'm going to do three things. First, I'm going to say a little bit more about the challenges to traditional realism as I understand them, trying to base this in views broadly endorsed in philosophy of science, and focusing especially on troubles stemming from widespread idealization. Then I'll motivate the possibility of a realism that is consistent with a rejection that science, that is consistent with the rejection of the idea that science is in pursuit of truth. Again, I'm going to be aiming to carve out a sort of generic place in philosophical space. I don't want to be wedded to any sort of nuances of my particular views that you might find off-putting. But here I will start to develop a position that kind of does take on more philosophical baggage, because I think there are certain sort of promising moves to make at that stage. And then finally, I'm going to address why I think this deserves to be called a scientific realism, and gesture towards what I think may actually be some advantages of this way of going about of being a realist. Realism without a strict commitment to truth, I think, better accommodates the nature of our present-day scientific achievements, and it also opens up an interpretation of cumulative scientific progress that resists the anti-realist pessimism. Or that's the aim anyway. Okay, so first, why we might see views endorsed in our field as challenging the idea bound up with traditional realism that science aims for truth. Several features of scientific modeling seem, at least on the face of things, to push against the idea that scientific findings should be judged by the metric of truth. First of all, and this is walking through sort of a bit more slowly, something I've already said to motivate the setup of the talk, the idea that scientific models have reduced commitments compared to theories. So I've sort of casually gestured towards a variety of philosophers who've worked on each of these points in my walk through this. There's more of an air of convenience in choice of modeling approach, it seems, than in theory selection. This relates also to the common practice of employing multiple different models to deal with the same phenomena. Second, and related to employing multiple models, as I've mentioned, there often or always, philosophers have argued, trade-offs among the advantages of different modeling approaches. So examples of views advocating that point, classic paper by Richard Levins, as well as work by John Mathewson and others. In other words, model design will need to prioritize either accuracy or generality, perhaps, again, in the classic Levins. And as Levins and others have emphasized, generality is often taken to be more desirable of the two goals. So there's sort of a motivation there specifically for a sacrifice of some accuracy for other goals. The significance of this in the present context is that compromises in truth or accuracy are at least sometimes made to further other scientific goals, right? So this is one point in scientific practices where it seems the goal of truth isn't sort of the main goal or the only goal that's at play. Oh, sorry, I'm behind on this again. Trying to keep things coordinated. Sorry if I get off here. Third and finally, as Elisa Bakulich and others have emphasized, model-based explanations, focusing in on models to start here, proceed with substantial assistance from idealizations or even fictions, as Bakulich has emphasized, introducing the possibility that false posits contribute to at least one variety of successful scientific explanations, that is, model-based scientific explanations. So for these reasons, insofar as model-based science is an important form of science, it seems that truth, approximate truth, or increasing degree of truth may not always be the best description of the accomplishments or even the aims of science. So in the rest of this initial discussion, I'm going to focus in on the role of idealizations in particular in putting some pressure on that, this traditional version of scientific realism. Okay, so by idealizations, I mean assumptions that are made without regard for whether they're true, often with full knowledge that they're false. Examples, sort of simple classic examples of idealization across different forms of science are assuming that a gas is ideal or perfect to do things like apply the ideal gas law. The assumption made in a variety of projects in population biology that like begets like, right? A sort of simple assumption of heritability of phenotypic traits. And then the assumption that was pressed on in, I think, our first talk today a little bit, if indirectly, made in a variety of economics projects, that humans are perfectly rational agents. All of these are idealizations, right? They're assumptions made without regard for whether they're true, and generally, these are things that we know to be false. So idealizations are widely recognized to contribute to scientific understanding and explanation. Many of our most heralded scientific explanations involve idealizations. This goes beyond, notice, the model-based explanations that Elisa Bakalich primarily focuses on, to include theory and law-based explanations as well. Consider, for example, Nancy Cartwright's decades earlier observations about the laws of physics. From the broadly recognized role of idealizations in scientific explanations, some philosophers, including me, have drawn the conclusion that explanations need not be true, that the understanding they produce is non-factive. These philosophers thus reject veritism about scientific explanation. Now, of course, no one claims that scientists are indifferent to the truth value of their accounts or prefer falsehoods to truth. The claims that are made here are subtler, such as that idealizations contribute directly to the epistemic success of our scientific explanations, and that less accurate explanations are sometimes better than more accurate alternatives. Okay, so put in terms of successful scientific explanations, here are my grounds for rejecting veritism. This is an attempt to sort of, in the context of, in a philosophical context, side note from the main goal of sort of rehabilitating scientific realism in this talk, in the context of philosophers of science who think about idealization, some of us concluding from this non-factivism about explanation, and others wanting to preserve factivism. This is sort of outlining for you why you might find reason to reject or at least question veritism about explanation from widespread idealization. So this is what seems important to me. I take it that these things are true, that an explanation Y can explain the target phenomenon without being entirely true. So we have explanations that aren't entirely true of the phenomena that they explain. Beyond that an explanation Y can better explain the target phenomenon, can be a more successful explanation than some other explanation Z, even though Z is more accurate of the phenomenon than Y. And finally, thinking about not sort of complete explanations, and I'll go through a really simple example in a second too, I won't just say all this generically, but zeroing in to the level of individual posits that comprise an explanation, that a posit P in some explanation Y can actually be crucial for Y explaining X without being remotely true, by being even while being radically false. Okay, so here are some very brief toy example illustrations of each of these ideas using the tried and true example of the ideal gas law, which I'll return to periodically through this talk. So first of all, an application of the ideal gas law can explain the approximate behavior of a real gas with molecules exhibiting attractive or repulsive interactions despite the real gas's properties deviating from the ideal gas law's predictions. Right? This is just saying that the ideal gas law can be explanatory, even though, right, it's not entirely true of any real gas. Second, in many circumstances, the ideal gas law explanation is preferable to a more accurate explanation that could be developed by deploying the van der Waals equation. There's something better, punchier, deeper about the ideal gas law explanation, in at least some circumstances, than the more accurate alternative that's available. And third, the posit that a gas is ideal, that is, that it's composed of non-interacting point particles, is crucial for an ideal gas law explanation, but may nonetheless deviate significantly from the properties of a real gas that the ideal gas law is applied to. So the posit P in this question is the idealization that the gas in question is ideal. So a note about my example choice. Like I said, I'm going to use this sort of packed toy example throughout this talk. I think that this suffices here insofar as the disagreement on factivism or non-factivism at this point doesn't hinge on whether there are examples that have these features, I think. I think folks who are impressed at the role of idealization in explanation will broadly accept these 3 points. I think what's at issue is whether this is enough to give up on veritism. So this is my sort of quick walk through why I think you should take seriously the challenges to veritism about explanation and understanding. Okay. So many buttons. Okay, so other philosophers, as I've already mentioned, accept the idea that idealizations contribute positively to scientific explanation, but have developed accounts that seek to retain veritism. For example, Insa Lawler, Emily Sullivan, and Corinne Khalifa, and then Chris Pincock, who I've already mentioned. One motivation for developing a veritism about explanation that accommodates idealization is the thought that this will enable scientific realism to be retained. Nonetheless, in this talk, at least for the sake of argument, let's take seriously the view that these features of idealization warrant reconsidering whether or to what extent truth is a requirement or even an aim of our scientific accounts. So as I said before, I haven't said enough to convince you that I'm right about all this, but hopefully I've said enough to motivate this as a problem that sort of creates enough questions that you're interested to see how we could be scientific realists, even if this turned out to be right. There may be a way to rehabilitate a central role for truth, but on the face of it, the important roles for idealizations, false assumptions, in our scientific accounts of the world, as well as the features of model-based science that I discussed earlier, seem to support looking for a scientific realism that does not require a commitment to truth, approximate truth, or increasing truth of our scientific accounts. Put another way, it sure would be convenient, right, if we could have a realism without worrying about this sort of thorny side issue of whether veritism is correct or not. At the very least, such a realism can remain non-committal on these questions of the extent to which truth is a benchmark for epistemic success in science, thus sidestepping the complications of scientific modeling and idealization that have received lots of attention in recent philosophy of science. All right. Okay, so far I've used scientific modeling and idealizations to motivate the idea that it might be beneficial to develop a form of scientific realism that doesn't require strict truth. I say this series too many times and stop. Strict truth, increasing truth, or potentially even the pursuit of truth in scientific accounts. Now I want to outline the form such a realism might take, again, to make sort of proof of the possibility of establishing this kind of a view. Here too, I'm aiming for carving out a general place in philosophical space. So I'm going to start pretty generic, but I will also develop a specific version of the view that I want to advocate, influenced especially by the use of idealizations in science that I described above. The first task, the starting point, has to be finding a more generic formulation of realism that doesn't already presume a commitment to truth, right? That sort of gives us the space to operate in, and then we have to do something in that space to develop a realism. So here's Anjan Chakravarty again in the same SEP entry that I drew from earlier, a bit later in the article. He says, what all of these approaches, and he's talking about ways of defining realism in terms of epistemic achievement, what all of these approaches have in common is a commitment to the idea that our best theories have a certain epistemic status. They yield knowledge of aspects of the world, including unobservable aspects. So in this formulation, realism is, at its most basic, the idea that our scientific accounts, that is our theories, our models, and all the rest, accounts is going to be the generic term that I use in this talk. The idea that our scientific accounts qualify as epistemic achievements and yield knowledge of the world. This seems to capture a commitment to realism at its most basic, and it also creates room to maneuver. If there's a natural way to interpret scientific accounts as epistemic achievements that yield knowledge, despite their sacrifices of truth, then that will enable a form of realism to be preserved. So that's the space to operate in. So in what way, if any, do our scientific accounts yield knowledge bearing on observable and unobservable entities, despite potential sacrifices of truth? On this initial question, insight can be gained from a convergence of views among recent accounts of idealization and explanation. So I'm drawing here from, or some of the views I have in mind at this point are Elisa Bokolich's, which I've already mentioned, work by Batterman and Rice, and some work that I've done as well, primarily, but among others as well. So all of these philosophers, in one way or another that I just mentioned, in different terms and with different sort of nuances to the position, emphasize patterns. So, for example, here's Elisa Bokolich. She says, the model explains the explanando by showing how elements of the model correctly capture patterns of counterfactual dependence of the target system. So we heard about this view in Andre's take just before this. And here's me in my idealization book. Scientific knowledge consists of truth about causal patterns. Grasping those truths about causal patterns comprises understanding of the phenomena embodying the patterns. Truths of causal patterns are by and large partial untruths about phenomena, accomplished with the use of idealizations. Catherine Elgin is another name that I think is important in this general territory. She focuses less explicitly on patterns, but her emphasis on the aim of exemplification, which plays a big role in her 2017 book, True Enough. Her emphasis on the aim of exemplification suggests implicit reliance, I think, on pattern or a similar concept as well, instantiation of a property or a relation across some range of circumstances. So this philosophical convergence suggests, I think, a potential way forward. Such patterns might be the objects of our scientific knowledge. I want to call this causal pattern realism. So this is going to be the sort of endpoint goal realism that I'll be developing this talk. This would be, I think, a form of selective realism, perhaps akin to a kind of structural realism. Realism about the relations depicted in our scientific accounts, not taken as descriptions of the targets of investigation directly, but of the patterns those targets of investigation embody. So something like that, I think, is a basic idea of sort of, again, room to maneuver is backing off from interpreting scientific realism as a commitment to the truth or approximate truth or increasing truth of our scientific theories, to aiming instead for epistemic success and generation, particularly of scientific knowledge. And now, sort of, this is a potential place to look for where we might find that knowledge, if it's not knowledge strictly of phenomena themselves. Okay. So the key move here, in what I just sketched, is allowing non-identity between the target of investigation and the object of knowledge. You may study or learn about one thing while the object of knowledge is technically something else. This non-identity, I think, creates two issues that need to be addressed for this kind of a view. Again, even if you have some differences in the specifics than what I develop in this talk. First of all, there's a question of the difference. In particular, the difference between the target of investigation and the object of knowledge. If the latter is not the same as the former, then what is it? Is the object of knowledge structure, patterns, or something else? Implicit in this question is the need to justify why this, whatever we settle on, should be taken to be the intended object of our scientific knowledge. Right? What is important about this such that it should be posited as what scientific knowledge is about? The second issue that needs to be addressed, if this difference is established, regards the connection between the target of investigation and the object of knowledge. If we accept that these aren't connected by the relationship of identity, right? If our scientific knowledge isn't strictly speaking about the targets of our scientific investigation, then how are these related such that this knowledge qualifies as an epistemic achievement about whatever it is that's occasioning the investigation? There must be some special relationship, even if it's not identity, for this to be the case, for this sort of overarching picture to be a scientific realism about what science is actually investigating. So here are my suggestions for addressing these two issues, for causal pattern realism in particular. I've already suggested, on the basis of some recent views about the explanatory value of idealizations, that the object of scientific knowledge might be causal patterns, what Bakulich has called patterns and counterfactual dependence. In my view, at least by and large, these regard the manipulability relations that constitute causal dependence. Postulating causal patterns rather than causal relationships or processes as the object of scientific knowledge reflects the scientific practice of strategically focusing on some difference makers to identify the scope of dependence, that is, the scope of what Woodward calls the invariance of a causal relationship. So that's the pattern bit, right, is focusing in on some causal relationship so as to ascertain the scope of conditions over which that cause or those causes have this effect. Beyond according with the insights of several recent accounts of idealization, this also captures well science's frequent focus on general laws, patterns, and tendencies. Many causal patterns, like the pattern depicted by the ideal gas law, are broad regularities that are limited in scope and can have exceptions. Sometimes scientists are instead interested in accounting for the interplay of multiple causes. That's okay. It doesn't have to all be general regularities. So this motivates a focus on a more specific causal pattern, I think, with a narrower scope. That is, a pattern that's present over a smaller range of phenomena. The van der Waals equation, with additional parameters specifying molecular size and attraction, depicts a more specific pattern with a narrower scope for any particular version of van der Waals equation than the ideal gas law. As this illustrates, any target of investigation, such as the behavior of some real gas, embodies multiple, perhaps even countless causal patterns. The strategic isolation of one set of causal factors gives rise to a focus on just one causal pattern among many that are embodied in the target of investigation. Just as it is a matter of choice which phenomena are targeted in scientific investigation, it's also, on this view, a matter of choice which causal pattern embodied in some given phenomenon is targeted in the investigation. So this many-one relationship between causal patterns and target phenomena is, in my view, of central importance. Insofar as our scientific knowledge regards causal patterns, the resulting knowledge is inevitably an incomplete perspective on the target of investigation. And when idealizations facilitate the knowledge, this perspective is enabled by false posits about other features of the target that are incidental not to the target itself, but to the focal pattern. Causal pattern realism thus introduces a variability in our scientific knowledge that goes beyond what phenomena our investigations target. The nature of our scientific knowledge is, on this view at least, relational to the sets of causes deemed interesting by investigators or their audience. So this might be considered to be a form of perspectival realism. This view is in some respects similar, I think, to Michaela Massimi's perspectival realism, as we'll see in her forthcoming book and some other recent work. Particularly, it relates to her emphasis on realism regarding robust phenomena. But on the other hand, from my view, the status of qualifying as knowledge is not indexed to research contexts. And this sort of feature is often considered to be a feature of perspectival realisms. So in my approach, the role for perspective is just one thing. It's simply in what knowledge is prioritized, that is, knowledge of which causal pattern or causal patterns. Thus, what I have in mind for the difference between the objects of scientific knowledge and targets of investigation is that of causal patterns versus the phenomena embodying those and other causal patterns. The key difference this approach has for the relationship between truth and knowledge is that idealizations, like the posit that a gas is ideal, can contribute directly to knowledge of causal pattern, even as they introduce falsehoods of phenomena. So why create this gap, what I've called the difference? First, causal pattern realism responds to the considerations that I raised in the first part of this talk, accommodating scientific practices that appear to be driven by considerations other than maximizing the truth of our scientific accounts. Second, an advantage of this approach to realism is that it's consistent with how science has developed many different accounts of the very same phenomena. And third, a promissory note. I will, as I think I've already told you that I will, in the third part of this talk, I'm going to suggest what I take to be some further philosophical advantages to embracing this kind of an approach to realism. Okay, but first, now that we have my view of the difference, right? What the divergence is between the targets of scientific investigation and the objects of scientific knowledge, I now need to do sort of the second step of saying what the connection is at all. I can't do the difference part of the job too well, or else science actually isn't generating knowledge about what it targets in its investigations, and that seems like a problem. So why take knowledge of causal patterns to constitute an epistemic achievement about phenomena? The brief answer is that when a causal pattern is embodied in a phenomenon, knowledge of that causal pattern, I think, can explain the phenomenon. Given the many-one relationship between causal patterns and target phenomena, there's more that I have to say about the conditions in which knowledge of the former suffices to explain the latter. So here I'll sketch those conditions, but the approach requires moves that I won't be able to make fully precise or adequately defend in this talk. I'm sort of gesturing in the direction of where I would go here. This is more fully developed, albeit in a different philosophical context, in my 2017 idealization book. So to start, behind again. To start, let's presume that a given scientific account qualifies as knowledge of some causal pattern, since what is at issue here is how that knowledge in turn relates to the target of investigation, such that it constitutes an epistemic achievement about that target. In my view, to explain the target of investigation, such an account must relate both to the target phenomenon, how that phenomenon is characterized in the explanandum, and then also to the audience in the proper ways. More specifically, first, the pattern, the causal pattern, the causal pattern, knowledge of which qualifies as an explanation of the phenomenon, must be embodied by the target phenomenon. This entails that the causal claims in the account of the pattern are approximately true of the phenomenon. Importantly, though, these causal claims don't need to be a comprehensive account of the phenomenon, but merely depict the influence of at least one causal factor, right? This is the sort of set of causal influences that is selected by our researchers in order to determine this causal pattern, the nature of this causal pattern in the phenomenon. Even the same causal factor or factors may be depicted differently in characterizations of distinct causal patterns. But the claims themselves, not the idealizations, right, but the claims the claims posits claim to be true must still be approximately true. Yes. Okay, sorry, trying to decide whether to make a little complication there, but decided not to. Second, this causal pattern that actually is embodied by the phenomenon, right? And that the depiction of the causal pattern has roughly true causal claims. This causal pattern must account for the explanandum. That is, the features of the target phenomenon that are specified in the call for explanation. Roughly put, this means that what the depiction of the causal pattern, including any idealizations, would entail is specified by the approximately true explanandum sorry. Roughly put, this means that what the depiction of the causal pattern, including any idealizations, would entail is in fact specified by the approximately true explanandum as having occurred. This is a sort of explanatory match, I think, that's required. Any given causal pattern embodied in a phenomenon can only explain features that conform to that pattern. There's going to be lots of properties of the phenomenon itself that a given pattern embodied by a phenomenon have nothing to do with. Imagine again the simple ideal gas law and what it can tell us about a real gas and what it can't tell us about a real gas. Third and finally, we get to the relationship to the explanatory audience. The depicted causal pattern must address the cognitive needs of those seeking explanation. Given the many-one relationship between causal patterns and target phenomena, and the inevitable relationality of depicting one causal pattern rather than another, there's an ambiguity to which causal pattern is explanatory that needs to be resolved, with reference to the agenda of those seeking explanation. This is influenced by their interests and background knowledge, as well as by incidental circumstances, potential biases, and blind spots. Specifying the explanandum can't resolve the ambiguity. Our simple ideal gas law example can show what these requirements amount to. The ideal gas law succeeds as an explanation of the pressure in a balloon doubling, let's imagine, when the volume was halved. This is the explanandum. The pressure in a balloon doubles when the volume is halved, some particular balloon on some particular occasion. The ideal gas law succeeds as an explanation of this when, first, the depicted relationship between pressure and volume is roughly true. Second, this application of the ideal gas law entails the pressure roughly doubling. And then third, the ideal gas law application addresses the explanation seeker's cognitive needs. So for this particular toy example, the way that I've set it up, I think this third requirement is the one that varies most often. So saying a bit more about that briefly. The ideal gas law application addresses the explanation seeker's cognitive needs when, for example, someone with a rough understanding of the relevant physics here, but who's forgotten the exact relationship between pressure and volume, or what other variables like temperature that relationship depends on, will find this explanation useful. This would not be the case. The explanation will not succeed, will not respond to the cognitive needs of those seeking explanation. For someone who well remembers the ideal gas law and how it applies in this instance, but thought that the temperature had also increased to an extent that the balloon's pressure would have caused it to pop. If that is the question that the explanatory audience has in mind, then what's needed is a different causal pattern, featuring different causal influences in order to account for the explanandum. So a background assumption here is that all scientific explanations are relative to the audience's cognitive needs in this way. The shared background knowledge of a scientific community may constrain the variety of causal patterns that are explanatory, but variability, I think, will persist, due to which specific questions are posed, which other phenomena are of interest, which methods are employed, and so on. This briefly is what I take to be necessary for knowledge of a causal pattern to constitute an epistemic achievement in the form of an explanation of the target of investigation. So again, this is the connection. This is why you should be impressed with scientific knowledge of causal patterns, even though causal patterns are not, strictly speaking, the targets of investigation. Okay. So much more, like I said, is needed to motivate this as the right way to think about scientific explanation. I've just given you an account, roughly an account, gestured towards an account of scientific explanation on one slide. Here, I'm simply sketching a view with the potential, I think, to connect target of investigation to object of scientific knowledge to flesh out what causal pattern realism amounts to. This view creates the desired space between objects of scientific knowledge and targets of investigation, while maintaining the requisite connection. The former are multiple, that is the former are multiple, the objects of scientific knowledge, while the latter, empirical reality, is single. Knowledge of the former inevitably yields only partial and perspectival insight into the latter. Okay, briefly taking stock. I've suggested the idea that science achieves truth. I have suggested that the idea that science achieves truth should not be taken to be a requirement for scientific realism. There may be a deep relationship between the objects of scientific understanding and the objects of scientific knowledge that's not a relationship of identity. In particular, perhaps science generates understanding of phenomena by providing knowledge of the laws, patterns, and tendencies those phenomena embody. This kind of view requires working out what the objects of scientific knowledge are, what I called the difference, and how that qualifies as an epistemic achievement about the targets of investigation, what I called the connection. I've indicated how those components of this form of realism play out for causal pattern realism, namely that we come to understand phenomena by generating knowledge of the causal patterns that they embody. So I want to end by suggesting that this way of being a realist not only is possible, right, that I can be a realist even though I have the wacky views that I have about idealization, but even that it has some advantages, that you might actually want to be this kind of realist, even if you're less suspicious than I am about truth as a name of science. So notice first that this approach suggests that the question of realism might be reformulated instead of, does science uncover legitimate knowledge even about unobservables, which I think is sort of a rough statement of a classic formulation of the question of scientific realism. We could reformulate this question to, about what, if anything, does science uncover legitimate knowledge? So the attention is shifted to the question of what the target is of scientific knowledge, or the object of scientific knowledge. What, if anything, should we be realists about on the basis of our scientific findings? So I have proposed that causal patterns are a candidate for this. In the epistemic sense, that claiming that we have scientific knowledge of them, and then also in the ontic sense, if I think we have scientific knowledge about causal patterns, then also in the ontic sense of positing the existence of causal patterns. Of course, that hasn't been my emphasis here. Causal patterns might well not be the only kind of thing that we should be realists about on the basis of scientific findings. That isn't a requirement of the view that I've outlined. So for example, I think some existence claims about individual events also likely qualify as legitimate scientific knowledge, such as life on Earth evolved from one or a few common ancestors, and adding the starch will turn this particular iodine solution blue. In some cases, scientific explanations may also provide knowledge of target phenomena themselves. I've pointed to idealization and features of scientific models as reasons to doubt that, by and large, this is so, but explanations that don't involve models or idealizations may not face these attendant complications, right? There's room for other things to be the objects of scientific knowledge, even if I'm right that causal patterns are some of those things. This version of selective realism is meant to replace a realism predicated on the requirement that scientific accounts aim for or achieve truth about the targets of investigation directly. It's meant to replace realism about the nature of phenomena depicted in science with a realism about some of the causal patterns embodied by those phenomena. And I think that's part of the important difference, right? Some of the causal patterns embodied by the phenomena that are under investigation. This approach to realism has some advantages over a realism that posits target phenomena as the objects of scientific knowledge. To start, this realism about causal patterns better accommodates some features of our present-day scientific achievements. The motivation for the approach, again, is accommodating scientific practices bound up with the production of scientific knowledge that don't seem to be in pursuit of truth, or at least not truth alone, as I walked through in the first part of the talk. Beyond that, this approach predicts a continuing plurality of scientific accounts of the very same phenomena whenever scientists are interested in different features of those phenomena, rather than movement toward a single integrated account. I take it that this well describes the present situation in many fields, as evidenced by the philosophical popularity of various forms of pluralism. It seems like we're all impressed by in one way or another, the proliferation of different kinds of accounts. This approach reconciles this continuing plurality of accounts with both a realist perspective and the expectation of a unitary empirical reality, both of which I at least find to be compelling ideas, worth maintaining if we can. Okay, so I wonder whether a causal pattern realism might not also open up an interpretation of cumulative scientific progress that resists the anti-realist pessimism. If we're traditional realists, then we must conclude that science has fallen short of knowledge again and again, and that theory change doesn't, by and large, seem to be getting us closer to truth. Many superseded scientific theories posit radically different views of the world. They thus must have been radically incorrect. Thus, the pessimistic meta-induction. Why think our current accounts are true when their many predecessors were not? If instead we're causal pattern realists, the outlook might be rosier. Taking our scientific achievements to constitute objective understanding of phenomena based in knowledge of some among many causal patterns enables a subtler accounting of what past scientific achievements have had right. The relationality of knowledge of causal patterns to the cognitive needs of the investigators and their audiences enables a possible explanation for radically different accounts. Though all of these accounts cannot be true, they might all achieve or at least pursue knowledge of different causal patterns from one another. Further, the sensitivity of our stores of scientific knowledge to the cognitive circumstances of scientists and their audiences can help legitimize the social influences on past scientific findings that other realisms may take to be threats. Now, of course, some scientific conjectures are simply wrong. So this account is not intended to entail that all past scientific claims were equally good or anything like that. Some scientific conjectures were proven to be straightforwardly wrong. They posit causal patterns that do not exist, one way of them being wrong anyway. But it's plausible to think that past science has latched onto some of the many causal patterns embodied in phenomena under investigation. Many previously accepted theories captured causal patterns that are embodied in phenomena, even if they were later replaced by other theories that depict other patterns, including sometimes more refined relatives of the original pattern. Causal pattern realism provides resources that may enable us to account for theory change resembling reduction of prior theories to their replacements in terms of related causal patterns, and radical theory change in terms of transforming priorities, questions, and background assumptions. Now, of course, one would need to motivate the plausibility of this approach for specific instances of theory change. And that's a project that's not only beyond what I can accomplish in this talk, but also, frankly, sort of beyond my strengths in philosophy. So my articulation of a causal pattern realism, how a causal pattern realism can accommodate theory change, is going to by necessity remain suggestive, hopefully. Something somebody else will try to do. Okay, so Kyle Stanford, Donna Tulodzicki, among others, have argued against selective realism's ability to rebut the pessimistic meta-induction. Both of these authors highlight how superseded theories fare poorly with regards to successful reference and approximate truth from the perspective of our current theories, which are presumed by the realist to be true. So that's the problem for a generic selective realism. Causal pattern realism, in contrast, does not posit the truth of our current best theories, at least not their truth of the targets of investigation. Because different accounts of the same phenomenon may target distinct and even unrelated causal patterns, misconstruing other features of the target phenomena along the way, these accounts may emphasize different aspects and even posit different entities. So from the perspective of a causal pattern realism, we shouldn't expect that a past theory's successes will be conserved from the perspective of current theory. But we do have grounds for suspecting that past scientific accounts succeeded at generating scientific knowledge of causal patterns apt for the epistemic and social locations in which they were formulated. There can be different and even incompatible ways to define causal variables that give rise to patterns of counterfactual dependence invariant over some range of conditions. Again, I want to repeat that this does leave intact the ability to diagnose shortcomings, both empirical and programmatic, in past research. Okay. Wrapping things up. Whatever knowledge science generates is in response to our cognitive needs. That much, I think, is uncontroversial. and our cognitive needs regularly motivate simplified accounts of our complex world. Simplified accounts privilege some aspects of phenomena to draw connections with other related phenomena while neglecting other aspects. This is one reason for the widespread value of idealizations, I think. In this talk, I've argued that these simplified accounts can qualify as knowledge, even if they are not strictly true of phenomena, insofar as they are knowledge of something else. It's often been said that science focuses on laws, regularities, and repeat phenomena rather than one-off events. It's not a far stretch, I think, to suggest that science achieves an understanding of phenomena, the events and occurrences of our world, by generating knowledge of some of the laws, patterns, and tendencies that these phenomena embody, that is, causal patterns. Causal pattern realism enables scientific realism to be maintained regardless of scientists' habit of sacrificing truth of phenomena for other epistemic priorities, and it holds promise for a realism-friendly interpretation of past scientific change and present scientific knowledge. Science is always in revision, but along the way, it could be that it's amassing ever more understanding via knowledge of causal patterns. The end. Thank you.
Okay, so we can take questions. Chris, go ahead. Yes, please.
Yes.
So thanks for a terrific talk. There's so much that's interesting here. One thing that I'll mention that I'd love to talk with you more about, and then I have a question. So I think a lot of the work about seeing theories as limiting, seeing one theory as a limiting case of a successor theory, really supports the view you had at the end. So I think there are, like, if you look at Newtonian gravity related to general relativity, I think it's really plausible to make the case that the causal patterns or the dynamical patterns of Newtonian gravity hold as a kind of limiting case of general relativity. So I think there's a lot of work that you could draw on to support that case. But I was curious about the role of pluralism in your argument. So let me try to, this might be an odd question, but imagine that you have a community that just focuses on quantitative precision of measurement of some small list of constants. And they decide that that's what they're going to seek as a satisfying explanation. How much of your argument would follow for them with that sort of narrow conception of explanation? Or how much is it dependent upon a community that has a broader range of explanations that they're considering?
Thank you. Before you walk away,
Yeah, sure.
I'm going to follow.
Okay,
Ask you a question.
yeah.
Is the question intended to be, is this imagined community also seeking causal patterns, or is the question intended to be, sorry, there was another option where I lost track of. Is that the right interpretation?
So the question, so there are various points where the argument depended upon a plurality of representations, sort of different causal patterns for the same phenomenon. And I was wondering if you had a community that sort of had a more, I don't know, sort of single focus, whether they should still accept causal pattern realism, or if they had a really narrow explanatory focus, whether some other version of realism would be amenable to that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, great question. So what I think is important, so I haven't thought through that question before, but what I think is important for causal pattern realism is not the recognition in the scientific community of multiple causal patterns so much as the in-principle existence of multiple causal patterns. So I did appeal to that, I think, in a variety of sciences. In fact, it is recognized that there are different types of research programs that you can do on deeply related phenomena. I think that does support the in-principle point as well. But even if, we can imagine sort of a strange society that had strange scientific practices to make a point. But even if we imagine within science some particular field that is quite limited in what it focuses on, I think the same points would hold. So a follow-up point. I think this does happen, or at least scientists in particular contexts have been accused of this in the past. I think maybe a good possible example that comes to mind is when Evo Devo folks and others started to press on the importance that was afforded to evolution and to selection in particular in biological explanations, and wanted to sort of the extended synthesis folks, I think in general, folks who want to point to the causal and explanatory significance of a wide range of different kinds of causes. One way that point has been developed is in sort of challenging the narrowness of prioritizing one particular type of cause when others are available.
Anton? Yeah, you have to come up to the mic.
Thank you. That is a very great talk. I might be have like 9 questions. So I'm wondering which part of your causal pattern realism would be disagreed by anti-realism? Because according to you, your theory just commit to the existence of causal pattern, and the causal pattern is just like a regularity between like events, right? But you also don't want to commit the truth of these events. So it sounds like the existence of these causal pattern depends on different theories. So I'm wondering how anti-realists would disagree with you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, great question. So a couple of responses. I think one place might be that part right at the end where I just said very quickly, so if I've said that we have scientific knowledge of causal patterns, then I've also told you that causal patterns exist. Moving on now. So I suppose an anti-realist might say to me, sure, you've shown me how science is good at uncovering regularities, but you haven't shown me that there is knowledge of something real. And why would you posit these weird, spooky patterns as something that's real? So I take it that something like that move is what Nancy Cartwright does decades ago in the How the Laws of Physics Lie book. As I recall, she says something very quickly in the paragraph, says something like, now if there were reasons to posit these as real, okay, but I don't see any grounds for that. So we won't do that. So that would be a place where there is a divergence. One could, it would be quite natural to challenge me on this. Why say those are real, such that what we're getting actually is knowledge of causal patterns. I'm not very sophisticated metaphysically, but maybe partly for that reason, I'm pretty open about what we say is real. Real things are things that are useful to talk about, unless there's sort of ceteris paribus, unless there's some reason to tell me that I'm wrong to posit the target of my conversation is real. So I don't have anything sort of super deep to say about why I think causal patterns are real. I do, though, and so this fits with what I said at the beginning of, I don't think I'm going to convince anyone that they should be a scientific realist on the basis of this. This is creating room to maneuver if you, like me, are worried about factivism and veritism, and yet think there's something to maintain in scientific realism. Yeah.
You check.
Thanks for a great talk. It's wonderful. And to me, this project is so attractive. I think I have 2 questions I want you to articulate more. First is when you were talking about the connection, and you have 2 points actually. The first one is you say that models that contain idealizations can derive or yield approximately true claims, and the second one is that those true claims must account for this parameter. So my question is, how can those idealized models which contain false assumptions have enough knowledge?
how can those idealized models can help us to derive the approximate true claims? And following this question is how important those idealizations play roles in such derivation.
Oh boy, sorry, I was gonna try to go to a different slide. Let's see. Yeah, I can still do that. Oh, sorry, it's gonna be ugly because I can't see the background to do it. I can't remember how far back to go. I'm sorry. I thought this was gonna be helpful, but I can't remember how far back to go it will be. I don't remember it. I'm sorry. Okay, tell me your second question one more time.
Sorry, two questions. The first one is the second one is how important those idealization play in this derivation, because you derive true claims from false models, right?
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So let me walk through that a little bit more slowly, anyway, than I did initially. Those are great questions. I say two really standard things in 1 and 2 here, but there are in the first and the second condition here, but they are intended in a way that I think is non-standard. So what I say is that for a causal pattern to explain, the causal pattern has to be embodied by the phenomenon that it's explaining and account for the exponent. So that's like, put that way, it's I think pretty generically not endorsed, but it has been suggested by lots of different philosophers. But the details matter here. So what I mean by the causal pattern being embodied by the phenomenon is that just the causal claims that the depiction of the causal pattern includes have to be roughly true, which, as I said, can be a sort of, and often is a narrow slice of all of the causal information that there is to be known about a system. So the requirement for causal accuracy is quite narrow in that sense and can be supported on this view by lots of idealizations, lots of falsehoods about other features of the system. And then the second component, this idea that to explain an explanandum, that the depicted causal pattern must roughly entail the explanandum, must account for the explanandum. That is separate from the first requirement in that I think it's quite unusual that the causal picture itself gets there, but rather, again, you make liberal use of idealizations in order to get this approximate match. So since I said all of that abstractly, maybe, does it help really quickly? Maybe I'll try an example if you wanted to.
Let me put the question maybe another way, because you want to derive something true from something false, roughly speaking, right? I mean, of course, details matters, but here, this thing's attention. How can you do that, right? So, I mean, people arguing say, we are going to say, well, those idealizations are not really essential. They just play some harmless role, right? They do not block true causal factors to come in the explanation. So they are just play some peripheral roles in the derivation. But I mean, according to your talk previously, I mean, you emphasize their idealization play really important roles in some cases. So I really want to know, like, how important idealization could be in such derivation, right?
Yeah. So I think one main reason, and this probably will be satisfying, so you'll have to come back and tell me again how I can improve my answer and what you're trying to get at. But I take it this is a reason that idealizations are employed because it helps the derivation, because it helps with mathematical tractability and other reasons to make contact with the phenomenon, right? So our scientists assume that a gas is perfect, not because it's fun, but because it enables this really simple mathematical representation of some of the basic properties or interrelationships among the properties of the gas.
Cool.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's good. It's very
okay.
good. And sorry for staying so long, because that's a second short question, I think relates to Yanzong's question. When you're talking about, there's another aspect about causal pattern realism, you mentioned the ontic aspect. ontic causal pattern realism. I was wondering what kind of picture you want to convey. Like, what, for example, what's the relationship between those ontic causal pattern realism and ontic structural realism by Ladyman? So what is there? So what's ontologically existing there?
Okay, yeah. So I can say a couple of things that might help there. So it's important for me to say I'm not saying that causal patterns are real and phenomena are not real, right? So it's not that I'm substituting the reality of causal patterns for manifest reality around us. So that's maybe an important difference from structural realism. I also think there's some really similar moves in certain respects, and I haven't fully been able to work through what to say how this view relates to a Ladyman style view, other than in what I just specified. Beyond that, what does it mean? I guess this is where I got to before in response to a different question. What does it mean for me to say that causal patterns are real? So like I said, it's not to substitute for sort of manifest reality around us, but I think it is a claim about the robustness and trying to not say reality, the robustness and significance of a broad range of counterfactual relationships, like I said, by and large, I think that fit with our concepts of causation, and not seeing any reason to stop short of saying that those are real. Like I said, I'm not metaphysically sophisticated.
Okay, so let's take a question from the Zoom audience. Philip, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. So thank you so much for the talk. It's really fascinating, and I think we're sort of much in alignment on a lot of things. I guess one thing that I wanted to press on a bit was this idea that you're relying on knowledge of causal patterns, but in some sense, this seems to be like pushing the factivists just like one step further, without actually getting away from, in some sense, what they want. And it seems to me like the broader sort of problem with factivism is that they are demanding a kind of realism that depends on a sort of naive correspondence with reality that just doesn't get at like the realities of scientific practice. And so it seems like any sort of realism that's worth having, so to speak, needs to in some sense spell out what it means for the objects of knowledge, be they causal patterns or what have you, what it means for them to be true in a sort of operational way that is like actually useful for like human reasoners. And that seems like the sort of deeper problem with factivism is just this problem that this idea that correspondence with reality is the only sort of normative ideal that's worth having, but it seems like that's not a normative ideal that is like operationally useful.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you just said. So I want to say two things in response. First, one move that I make in sort of trying to stand up or at least sketch out this causal pattern realism that I think is really important here. It's again back to this many one, right? There are lots of causal patterns in any given phenomenon. So there is this sort of initial role for human choice. Often, I think this is implicit and not sort of an explicit part of settling on the research program, but something done quickly in the background, or maybe inherited by one's advisor, etc. But I take it that is an important move for a causal pattern realism that differentiates it from a more traditional scientific realism in that it makes it similar in these ways that I tried to sketch to perspectival realism, that there's a way in which our knowledge is indexed to human interests, not because it qualifies as knowledge only because of our interests, but because our, or a subset of our occasioning interests directed our attention to the type of knowledge that we gain. So you do get this sort of way in which the content of scientific knowledge is indexed to and dependent on human interests in a way that I think fits pretty well with what we see in science. The second thing that I was going to say, and this responds to what I thought you were initially going at the beginning of your comment, was something like, I thought you said at the beginning something like, well, isn't this just a factivism then, right? It's just that you've told us that we should be factivists or veritas, that our scientific accounts are true of something slightly different. And I definitely think that is a thing that some people have said, and that I think can be said. I think, though, that there are risks to overemphasizing costs, I think is a thing to say. There are costs to overemphasizing sort of truth conservativeness to our philosophical accounts here, in that we then sort of brush to the side of our attention and minimize really important features of scientific activity, like what I just mentioned about the ways in which our accounts are indexed to human interests or to a specific subset of interests of those occasioning an investigation. And then backing up or sort of moving slightly somewhere else, if we just move quickly, if we, from the sort of view that I tried to quickly put together at the beginning of this talk, if we conclude not we should reject veritism, but instead, we need to kind of refine a little bit the ways in which science is after truth. I think that kind of an approach brushes under the rug the epistemically significant ways in which our scientific accounts need to be false of phenomena. and sort of, if we don't, if I don't stamp my foot and say, but no, veritism about our explanations is wrong, then we sort of lose the payoff of taking very seriously the role of idealization that I think is really productive to take seriously. So I don't know if you intended that as part of your question, but it seemed like me.
John.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you.
Hello. So I'm interested in what you mean by addressing the cognitive needs of the people seeking explanation. So one thing that could mean is just whatever their sort of felt need for an explanation is. So maybe coherence with some other crazy stuff that could be consistent with it. Or there could be kind of a more objective sense of a need, something where there are facts about what will fulfill that need. And then I wonder if truth can sort of sneak in the door this way, because maybe that's a way of thinking about what cognitive needs are, maybe establishing some kind of relationship to the truth. So I wonder what you think about that.
Good, okay, thank you. Yeah, so I think there's a way in which that last bit is right. So I don't want to, like I said that I'm wacky or something earlier, but I don't want to be like totally wacky. Like I think that there is an objective reality out there that science is trying to have epistemic success with. It's just a question of how best to describe that success. Yeah, so what does it mean to say that successful explanations are responsive to cognitive needs? It's not intended in this entirely subjective sense of whatever people think will be satisfying, that's good, right? And that's back to, I won't go through changing the slides again, but I can get that with the first two conditions that I gestured towards for successful explanation, that the causal pattern that is depicted and offered as an explanation can't succeed as an explanation if it's not actually embodied in the phenomenon, right? It can just straightforwardly, a depiction of a causal pattern can just be wrong, right? Doesn't get the counterfactual relationship and the manipulability relations right. or it can go wrong by saying something true, but that doesn't account for what the target of the explanation is, right, for the explanation. So there are objective requirements on how an explanation can satisfy cognitive needs. But that, what I would try to emphasize briefly is that really, those objective requirements really undetermine what a good explanation is, right? So I really quickly gestured at, I can sort of concoct a scenario in which you telling me, describing the ideal gas law to me, those relationships will explain to me, given my background knowledge and interests, why the pressure roughly doubled when the volume roughly half when I squeeze the balloon. But then it's very easy to also imagine background knowledge and interests that I have such that that's totally irrelevant. That's not what I was asking about. That might be because I already know that, right? Again, background knowledge is an important factor here, or it might be because I'm not interested in that. What I want to know is why is, wait, I have to get the exponential right to get an example here. So why did the pressure roughly double when the volume was roughly half when I squeezed it? It could be that I guess the example I gave briefly in the talk, it could be that I thought the temperature had gone up radically in this case. So why didn't it pop, right? So then same explanandum, but different background knowledge or a different set of questions such that the causal pattern that is depicted is not actually explanatory.
Okay.
So I think you started to kind of address that question just now, but I kind of spaced out for a second. So sorry if this is totally a duplicate, but my worry is precisely with two here. My intuition is like, I think you're right, but in the example you gave, I'm not totally sure. And so if I had this right, you were comparing the ideal gas law with the van der Waals equation, and saying that the van der Waals equation, and saying that the ideal gas law was a better explanation, even though I see, can be, okay, even though it's less accurate of it. But so, in what sense is there an explanation I can give with the ideal gas law that I couldn't give with the van der Waals, and then in fact it would sort of be truthier with the van der Waals? Yeah, so it's just
Good.
kind of
So if the conditions are such that you explaining this squeeze balloon to me want to illustrate the broad range of conditions in which roughly this relationship holds, because you're a nerd and trying to teach your kid about these broad physical regularities, let's say, then getting into the weeds of specific, what does van der Waals give us? I don't remember my notes. Molecular size and attractive and repulsive forces is just beside the point, right? It's not giving you anything cognitively important. And in fact, it's suggesting a kind of specificity to the explanation, such that I'm left, the audience, I'm left without the knowledge that this relationship will hold regardless of those factors, those variables, parameters.
Yeah, I see. Okay, so in that sense, though, my intuition is sort of like, okay, so it's heuristically better or pedagogically better in that case, but is it better?
It is, because, and this gets past the things that I've sort of spent much time on this talk, but because explanatory content includes not just, explanatory content, on my view, is causal patterns, not just saying because volume, right? Because volume halved, pressure doubled, but indicating the scope of conditions over which that relationship obtains. So if we sketch a really general relationship between the halving of volume and the doubling of pressure, then that's a really powerful, broad regularity about the world you've just told me about. And that explanation is epistemically better than something specific and detailed and picky that you could have told me in some cases.
Okay.
Not in all cases.
I see. Okay.
And so it is that sort of the counterfactual content, right? The scope of the regularity, communicating that information that is important about, in some cases, of these broader explanations that sacrifice accuracy.
Okay. So the idea then is that the ideal gas law is sort of encodes a richer set of counterfactuals than the okay. I'll think about this one now.
Yeah, so this is, I tried to connect to Woodward, like his, he requires that a causal relationship has some range of invariance. And so I want to build on that and say it's explanatory content to give that information as well. And I think every explanation provides that information. And so you get this sort of potential mismatch if it's overly picky and narrow for the explanatory context.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Bill's gonna have to wait. We have a question over here. Sorry, Bill.
Thank you for your great talk. And as you said,
You'll have to speak up.
as you said, you try to make room for those people who want to be scientific realist, but don't claim that scientific theories are true. So, but I have a simple question. Is there any room in your approach for those people who defend non-causal explanations? Because if I'm right, you introduce understanding as the aim of science instead of truth. And by understanding, you introduce causal pattern and the role of causal pattern in your approach. So what's the role of understanding as the aim of science if we cannot introduce causal patterns? Because I'm sure that there are not lots of, but some good examples that we have non-causal explanations. So what's, if we cannot introduce causal patterns in these cases, what would be your approach regarding to these examples?
Thank you, great question. So I said once really briefly something like mostly causal patterns early on in my talk today. So I don't think that all scientific explanations have to be causal. There are, but the details matter, I think, because there are some arguments for a non-causal explanation that I think are consistent with what I want to call causal explanation. So Andre's talk earlier mentioned sort of counterfactual dependence that Elisa Bakulich and Colin Rice emphasize. I think that they do slightly different things with that counterfactual dependence, but so addressing each of those, Elisa Bakulich, at least as I read some of her work, wants to emphasize that the extent of the fictionalization of the account means that it can't be causal. And I want to resist that. So I think we do all sorts of scientists do all sorts of things with idealizations, and an account can be highly fictionalized while still depicting causal patterns. So I don't want to give up that. Colin Rice, the best I read him, rejects a Woodwardian manipulability approach to causation. I also am sort of pretty deeply committed to that as a very natural way to talk about causation. I think as I try to work through a little bit in my idealization book, I think there's a way in which that approach to thinking about causation is epistemically basic to science, so really important. And so I also don't think that sort of a lack of a straightforwardly sort of physical causation diagnosis for a counterfactual relationship is a reason to say it's not a causal pattern. Okay, so sorry, I'll try to generalize. In general, I think I want to I think that there are good reasons to be very broad about what we take to be accounts that are depicting causal patterns, both in sort of how fictionalized they are and in leading into sort of counterfactual analysis of causation. But I think that there are some good examples in the literature for explanations in science that are not as well analyzed by that kind of an approach, where the feature of a system that seems really important isn't something that sort of admits of manipulability in the way that we would want, right? If we're talking about sort of formal constraints on the system, again, back to Andre's talk, or a few other situations. So I don't think that every explanation in science is based on causal patterns. I do think that it's an incredibly common strategy, and I suspect, though I haven't sort of worked this through, that explanations that don't depict a causal pattern might still be pretty deeply related in depicting, might still be pretty deeply related to the explanatory value of what causal patterns have to offer something like that. Sorry, too much in the weeds.
Okay, so we're going to go to Robin, and then Bill will be the last.
Hi, thank you. So you mentioned that there are methodological choices made when investigating some of these phenomena. And I'm wondering if there's any like empirical methodological implications to taking a causal pattern stance and like seeing that as the object of scientific investigation, if there's any more particulars about that.
Good, yeah, it's a great question. The first thing that occurs to me is this point that I tried to emphasize on the continuation of multiple different accounts of a particular phenomenon. And so I think that one implication is that more related answers are occurring to me, so I'm having a harder time reining in my response. One implication is that we should expect to see multiple different accounts of deeply related phenomena, and we shouldn't see scientists try too hard to integrate those. At least not all scientists, right? So proliferation of approaches, some of which might integrate, some of which maintain distinct approaches. Not integrating them. A related point, which I don't think quite gets to the level of methodological implication, but I think is an important sort of normative upshot of this kind of a view, is that if we have a successful scientific explanation for some phenomenon, that is not reason to think that we have the explanation for that phenomenon and that the other scientists working from a different perspective are going on about things the wrong way. And I think this is a really common scenario where people with different scientists within different approaches targeting similar phenomena tend to talk as if one has to choose and one's right or the other is wrong. And I think it would be great for everyone involved if we appreciated more fully that we can have lots of different explanations for deeply related phenomena that target different types of causal factors.
Okay, Bill, thank you for being patient. You can ask a question.
Sorry, a lot of what I was going to say, I mean, Chris said quite a bit of it at the beginning, but I think that the idea of one of the nice things about, I'm not about the causal pattern line you're taking is the recovery of the causal patterns in the relevant context by the successor theories. And as Chris said, GR really, in the solar system, one of the really important things that not only in getting Mercury's extra, the famous 43 seconds extra, but he was, of course, recovering the 531 seconds that are coming from interactions from Newtonian causal patterns related from the other planets, and one of the things George Smith has been pushing was that the fact that it was a really important thing in Einstein's developing the theory was that he would recover all those patterns, but in addition you'd have the extra thing that you got at Mercury. I think that part I think that part is importantly right. I was gonna, no, I think I'll just, no, I think I'll, oh no, oh yeah, that's what, and the other thing, there's, Howard Stein for a long time has, in a number of papers, talks about understanding. And in particular, he, in a retirement thing for Isaac Levi, a paper that, in a number of other papers, but I think getting at the causal patterns the way you've been describing is pretty much what Howard meant by understanding.
Well, that's great to hear. Yeah. So I'm not familiar with that work, so I'll have to dig it up. And then it's great to hear that what I said about sort of theory change resonated also. That's one of those kinds of claims that's sort of far enough afield from my expertise that I sort of say it and then kind of cover my head to make sure I didn't say something silly. So that's helpful to hear.
Okay, let's conclude the day by thanking Dr. Potochnik.